Imagine losing your daughter to a city's mistake, and years later, they come for the only place that helped you heal. Welcome to Riverstone Heights, where the frogs croak, the creek whispers, and the HOA, well, they just declared war on nature and one man's backyard. Jack Walker was a quiet plumber with a quiet life, until the Maple Valley HOA rolled in with gold-lettered threats and clipboards full of rules. His beloved creek, once a haven for neighborhood kids, was now labeled a drowning hazard. And when Jack refused to drain it, the fines started pouring in. But he didn't back down. He investigated. He uncovered secrets. He exposed sabotage. And when the rain returned, so did karma, with a flood that swallowed the very foundations of those who tried to bury the truth. This isn't just a story about water. It's about community versus control, truth versus intimidation, and what happens when nature fights back. Get ready for betrayal, scandal, poetic justice, and frogs with a vendetta. If you love real drama with stakes as high as a rooftop sandbag wall, this is your new favorite story. Subscribe to Real HOA Drama now and dive into the creek war they try to silence. Nature didn't forget. And neither will you. Jack Walker wasn't the kind of man who made a lot of noise. He was a plumber by trade, the kind who showed up on time, fixed your sink without fuss, and left with a polite nod and a muddy boot print or two. For 11 quiet years, he lived in the same modest home on Elm Street in Riverstone Heights, just a stone's throw from the edge of town where concrete gave way to cattails and the wild started whispering again. What Jack loved most about his home wasn't the cozy front porch or the way the sunlight hit the kitchen tiles in the morning. It was the creek, a thin ribbon of water that danced behind his backyard, curling past old stones and under a mossy wooden plank he called a bridge, though it was more like a memory of one. Every evening after a long day spent crawling under sinks and taming rusty pipes, Jack would sit on a folding lawn chair by that creek, a cold bottle of root beer in hand, and just listen. The water talked to him in a way people didn't anymore. Kids in the neighborhood loved the place too, especially Timmy and Ellie Thompson from 2 houses down. Timmy had a frog-catching bucket perpetually swinging from his wrist like an extra limb, and Ellie, who was 6 and deadly serious about everything, considered herself the tadpole relocation officer. They'd tiptoe across the rocks, whispering like spies, laughing when one of them slipped a foot into the water. Jack never minded. He'd smile from his chair, wave when they caught his eye, and always say the same thing, just remember to put him back where they belong. They always did. But that creek meant something deeper to Jack. It wasn't just a pretty patch of nature in a world that kept paving everything over. It was sacred. Because years ago, in a different town, Jack had a daughter named Lily. She was 6 when the city redirected a flood channel for a shopping center expansion and forgot to mark the area properly. She was gone in a matter of minutes. No signs. No fences. Just a quiet mistake that took everything from him. After Lily's death, Jack couldn't bring himself to look at water the same way. But when he found this house and the creek behind it, it felt like a second chance. Not to replace her. Never that. But to be close to something alive, something moving, something honest. The creek wasn't dangerous. It was healing. It held no secrets, no agendas. It flowed because it had always flowed. It carried dragonflies in summer, leaf boats in fall, and silent snowmelt in spring. It was dependable, and Jack had needed that. Over time, the neighbors came to know Jack not just as the plumber who fixed their garbage disposal in under 10 minutes, but as the quiet guy with a magical backyard. Kids called it the Frog Forest. Parents loved that their kids could roam freely under his gentle watch. Jack didn't say much, but his presence was solid, like the stones in his stream bed. But things were changing in Riverstone Heights. Jack didn't know it yet, but beyond the treeline, just over the hill where the new homes were springing up like weeds after rain, something was stirring. Something that didn't see the creek as a sanctuary at all, but as a liability, a hazard, a line on a map that needed erasing. And Jack, the quiet man who just wanted to let the water flow and remember his daughter in peace, was about to find himself in the middle of a fight he never asked for, a fight that would begin with a letter and end with a flood. But for now, the sun was low, the frogs were singing, and Jack Walker sat by the creek, unaware that his sanctuary was already under siege. It started with an envelope, one of those oversized, self-important ones that looks like it's trying too hard to be polite. Thick cardstock, fancy gold embossing on the corner that read Maple Valley Homeowners Association. Jack Walker held it like it might explode, because let's be honest, nothing good ever shows up in a gold-lettered envelope. Inside, a welcome packet. Or, more accurately, a Trojan horse in paper form. According to the enclosed letter, Riverstone Heights, the humble, peaceful neighborhood Jack had called home for over a decade, was being incorporated into the HOA of the much newer, much snootier Maple Valley development just over the hill. Apparently, 75% of the residents over there had signed off on it, which somehow meant everyone on Jack's side of town got roped in too. There were pages of rules, grass height requirements, trash bin regulations, seasonal decor limitations. Jack would later learn that even inflatable snowmen were a no-no. And then came the kicker, one line, tucked at the bottom of the last page, that hit harder than a pipe burst at midnight. Failure to sign and return this agreement within 30 days constitutes acceptance of all terms. Penalties for noncompliance may apply. Jack stared at the line for a long time. Then he did what any sane, creek-loving plumber would do. He tossed the packet on the kitchen table and muttered, "Yeah, right." That resolve lasted exactly 3 days. She arrived at 4:03 p.m. sharp, clipboard in hand, smile so tight it looked like it had been ironed on. Karen Westfield, Community Standards Director of Maple Valley HOA. And she came bearing a mission. "Good afternoon," she chirped, like a step-forward wife with a grudge. "I'm Karen Westfield. I noticed you haven't returned your membership agreement." Jack blinked. "I'm not interested in joining any HOA." Karen's smile didn't falter. "Oh, it's not optional. You see, your property deed contains a provision that allows for annexation if 75% of the surrounding community agrees. And they did. So, welcome aboard." She pulled out a highlighted copy of some document Jack barely remembered signing when he bought the house, fine print buried in a sea of legalese. Jack's jaw tightened. "I've lived here for over a decade. This neighborhood never had an HOA." Karen's voice dropped to the kind of syrupy tone used to explain things to small children and stubborn dogs. "We're simply bringing consistency to the area. You'll find our regulations ensure property values remain strong and uniform." Jack narrowed his eyes. "That code for you don't like my backyard." Karen tilted her head just enough to glance past him, toward the creek. "We will need to discuss that unauthorized water feature." And that's when Jack felt it, that slow boil of irritation that started somewhere deep in his chest. It's not a feature. It's a creek. It was here before the house was built. Karen tapped her clipboard. "Regardless, all water features must be reviewed and approved by the board. And properly fenced for safety. Children could be at risk." That was it. The line that changed everything. Jack signed the form that evening, not because he wanted to, but because attached to the unsigned document was a threat. Noncompliance will result in fines of up to $500 per day. $500
a day.
For a guy who fixed pipes and didn't even charge extra on weekends. As he handed the signed form over the next morning, Karen smiled again, victorious. "Wonderful. Our first HOA meeting is Thursday evening. And Jack," she added, eyeing the back of his property once more, "please prepare to discuss the issue of your creek. It's now officially under review." Jack closed the door behind her, the paper still warm from his reluctant hand. Somewhere outside, the creek kept babbling, oblivious. But Jack knew better. That gold-lettered envelope hadn't just changed the rules. It had declared war. Jack Walker wasn't one for town meetings. Too much posturing, too many pastries that looked better than they tasted. But this one? He couldn't miss it. Because on the HOA agenda, right after mailbox height standardization and holiday decor enforcement, was unauthorized water feature review. Elm Street.
Yep.
His creek had made the big leagues. The community center was packed. Jack sat halfway back in a metal folding chair that creaked every time he shifted, flanked by neighbors who looked just as confused as he felt. At the front stood the Westfields, Karen in a coral blazer so blinding it could redirect traffic, and Richard in a suit that screamed, "Golf executive, more than public servant." "Thank you all for coming," Karen chirped into the mic, flipping to the next slide on the projector. Moving on to safety concerns. Boom. A photo of Jack's backyard lit up the wall. His beloved creek in full view, with the old plank bridge, a few kids crouched on rocks, and most damning of all, a frog mid-leap like it was on trial. "This," Karen said, tapping the screen with a laser pointer like she was presenting a crime scene, "is the unauthorized water feature on Mr. Walker's property. It poses an immediate drowning hazard to children." Jack stood, face flushed. "It's a creek. It's 6 inches deep. I've had deeper puddles in my driveway." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but Karen didn't miss a beat. "Our regulations clearly state that all water features must be pre-approved and safely enclosed," she said, laser pointer now dancing over the image. "Open bodies of water, no matter how small, present multiple safety concerns, especially to children." That's when Julie Thompson stood up. Timmy and Ellie's mom. The kids who lived in that creek every summer afternoon. "My kids play there all the time," she said, voice calm but firm. "Jack watches them like a hawk. It's the safest place in the neighborhood." Karen smiled that smile again, tight, rehearsed, and venom-laced. "And do you, Mrs. Thompson, carry liability insurance for your children when they're on someone else's unregulated water feature?" Gasps. Literal gasps. Julie faltered. "What?" "Because," Richard chimed in smoothly, "should an accident occur, the HOA cannot assume responsibility for injuries sustained on a non-compliant property." Jack sat back down, jaw tight. They weren't just after the creek. They were using the kids, the joy of the neighborhood, as pawns in their bureaucratic game of power. And just when he thought they couldn't be more absurd, Karen flipped to the next slide. "This water source is also a known attractant of dangerous wildlife," she continued. "Frogs, for example, are breeding grounds for bacteria. They, in turn, attract raccoons, possums, both known carriers of disease." Jack nearly laughed. "Frogs? We're declaring war on frogs now." Karen didn't flinch. "The ecosystem must be balanced for safety and health." There it was. The moment it clicked. This wasn't about safety. It wasn't even about frogs or fences or bylaws. It was control. And Jack Walker had just been marked as a problem they intended to solve. As the meeting dragged on, Jack leaned back in his squeaky chair and watched Karen Westfield flip through her slides like a queen laying out battle plans. She wasn't here to help the neighborhood. She was here to remake it one frog, one stone, one unauthorized stream at a time. Well, let her try, Jack thought, eyes narrowing. Because if she wanted a war over 6 inches of water, she was about to get a flood. The night was quiet, too quiet for Jack Walker's liking. Even the frogs in his now-condemned creek had fallen strangely silent, as if they, too, were holding their breath. Jack stood at the edge of his backyard, flashlight in hand, eyes tracing the curve of the dry stream bed like a hunter studying a trail. He wasn't just a plumber anymore. He was on a mission. The whole unauthorized water feature excuse had never sat right with Jack. Karen and Richard Westfield had come down hard, too fast, like they had something to hide. And if there was one thing Jack had learned in his years elbow-deep in rusty pipework and lies from property managers, it was this. When people shout about rules, it's often to distract from the ones they're breaking. So that night, Jack walked upstream. It was a part of the neighborhood few ventured into, a patch of woods between Riverstone Heights and the fancy new Maple Valley homes, where the HOA brass lived in pristine, Pinterest-perfect palaces. As Jack pushed past overgrown brush and cattails, the beam of his flashlight caught a glint, metal, just beneath the reeds. He stepped closer. There, half buried in mud and tangled roots, was a drainage pipe. Large, industrial grade, and feeding directly into his creek. Jack let out a low whistle. Well. He traced it back through the undergrowth, following its path toward the base of the Westfields development. The pipe snaked under the fence line, straight into a retention pond tucked neatly behind the model homes. On paper, that pond was supposed to collect rain runoff. In reality, it looked suspiciously like it was being used to reroute the HOA's drainage problem onto Jack's land. And that wasn't even the worst of it. As Jack crouched low, snapping pictures with his phone, a sound in the distance made him freeze, the soft electric whine of a golf cart. He ducked behind a tree as headlights cut through the mist. Sure enough, it was Richard Westfield himself, rolling up like he was checking on his kingdom. He parked near the pond, looked around like a man about to do something he knew he shouldn't, then popped the lid off a plastic container and poured its contents, a thick, cloudy liquid, straight into the water. Jack watched in disbelief. Within minutes, fish floated belly up, shimmering like silver coins under the moonlight. It was sabotage. And it wasn't even subtle. Back home, Jack did what any man about to declare war would do. He got technical. He pulled out the old security camera he'd used during the Great Raccoon Invasion of 2018, rigged it to face the pond through the treeline, and camouflaged it behind a birdhouse no HOA would dare question. Then he waited. Over the next week, the camera recorded everything. Late-night dumping, strange vehicles, even HOA maintenance crews inspecting the pond during off hours. It was a goldmine of hypocrisy, and Jack backed up every file 3 times, including one copy labeled, "Just in case I die mysteriously." But Jack didn't just want to expose them. He wanted to corner them with their own sewage. And so he began building a case. Photos, video, maps, aerial overlays showing how the retention pond, the pipe, and his creek aligned like a bad magic trick. He even consulted a friend from the city planning office who confirmed what he suspected. That pipe? Never approved. Totally illegal. By the time Karen Westfield emailed Jack with an official $500 fine for failure to drain an unapproved water feature, Jack just smiled. Because the real flood wasn't in his backyard. It was coming for them. The morning after Richard Westfield dumped poison into the pond, Jack Walker wasn't nursing a coffee. He was nursing a cause. The HOA had crossed a line, and now he wasn't just angry. He was activated. At 8:02 a.m., Jack stood in the cluttered office of Dr. Rachel Martinez, a tenured professor in environmental science at the local university. Her office smelled like soil samples and chamomile tea. Stacks of impact reports towered around her desk like tiny cardboard fortresses, and a gecko in a terrarium blinked at Jack like it knew he didn't belong. Rachel adjusted her glasses, flipping through the folder Jack had handed her. Drainage pipe, connected to a retention pond, draining into a natural creek. And you say this was never permitted? Jack nodded grimly. Never even registered. The HOA just dumped their runoff on me for years. And now they want me to get rid of the creek. She leaned back slowly, tapping the edge of the folder. Your creek isn't just a backyard feature, Mr. Walker. It's a relief valve for an entire groundwater system. Block it off, and you build pressure until the water finds another way out. Like under the Westfields' homes? Jack asked. Rachel raised a brow. Exactly. Jack followed her out of the office, and they crossed campus to the geology department archives. There, nestled among maps older than Jack's plumbing license, she pulled out a geological survey from 1962. It showed everything. The stream, the spring it fed from, and a bold blue overlay labeled Seasonal Wetland, High Saturation Zone, right beneath where the new Maple Valley development now stood. In bold, development not recommended without hydrological mitigation. Jack exhaled. So they built an HOA on a swamp. Rachel smiled wry. In more ways than one. But Jack's crusade wasn't just winning science. He was beginning to win people. That afternoon, while Jack printed out copies of the old map at the town library, a voice behind him whispered, "You're the creek guy, right?" He turned to see Margaret Beckett, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who lived near the neighborhood entrance. Her white curls were tucked under a gardening hat, and her hands gripped a faded photo of a koi pond, peaceful, lush, with lily pads dancing across the surface. "That was my husband's pond," she said, voice cracking. "Built it himself when we moved here, in '87. Every morning for 15 years, we'd sit out there and drink coffee." Jack recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same one he'd seen in the mirror after losing Lily. She swallowed hard. "Last year, the HOA made me drain it," said it disrupted aesthetic cohesion. "They called it an eyesore." She spat the word like it tasted bad. "I begged them. Cried in front of that woman, Karen. But they threatened fines. Said if I didn't comply, they'd come tear it out themselves." Jack didn't have words. He just reached out and rested a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," Margaret said quietly, "for fighting. Someone has to." By sundown, Jack wasn't alone anymore. Neighbors began dropping by, not with casseroles, but with stories. A dad whose basketball hoop had been removed for being 2 inches above code. A woman fined for hanging wind chimes deemed audibly disruptive. A couple forced to paint their front door beige after Karen declared the shade of red provocative. The HOA had built its empire on silence and intimidation. But the silence was cracking. Jack pinned the 1962 map on his kitchen wall. Tacked beneath it were satellite photos, HOA violation letters, screenshots from a secret camera, and a sticky note that simply read, "Physics always wins." Outside, the creek still flowed. But now so did the truth. And justice, like water, was beginning to leak through every crack in the HOA's foundation. The rain came like a warning. Not a drizzle, not a polite spring shower, but a biblical, sideways sheeting, thunder-punching deluge. Jack Walker sat on his back porch, boots on, poncho draped over his shoulders, a thermos of coffee in one hand and a GoPro in the other. The SWOI, what little remained of it, was gone. HOA contractors had spent the past 2 days trenching and burying it in wide plastic pipes like they were disposing of a body. Karen Westfield stood smugly under a branded Maple Valley HOA umbrella as the last rock was dropped into the dry creek bed. "Order," she'd said, hands clasped like a Bond villain. At last. Now, the order was gone, and chaos was coming. By 1 a.m., Jack's phone started vibrating with alerts from the neighborhood group chat. "Water coming through my garage. Basement's filling up fast. Anyone else smell sewage?" Jack zipped up his poncho, clicked on the GoPro, and headed into the dark. When he reached Maple Drive, the scene looked like a disaster movie, except realer, wetter, and far pettier. Water surged from the storm drains like geysers. Lawns transformed into swamps. Trash cans floated by like lost ships. And right in the thick of it, wearing matching monogrammed raincoats, stood Richard and Karen Westfield. Karen, of course, wasn't helping the community. No. She was directing sandbags around her own pristine lawn like a general fortifying her castle. The other houses? Let them drown. Jack raised his camera. Click. Lightning forked above, illuminating the madness. Richard was shouting into his phone, flapping one hand uselessly while trying to sweep water from his driveway with a broom. Jack chuckled into his collar. "Good luck with that, Richie." Suddenly, Timmy was beside him, soaked to the bone in a dinosaur pajama set, boots squelching. "Mom said to come get you," he said breathlessly. "But I wanted to ask something." Jack knelt down, brushing wet hair from the boy's eyes. "What's up, bud?" Timmy looked at the swirling water and pointed toward where the creek used to be. "Where does the water go, when it can't go down the creek anymore?" Jack looked across the street, to where the Westfields' $1 million home now had water bubbling up from its foundation like a spring. He smiled, not cruelly, just knowingly, and placed a hand on Timmy's shoulder. "We're about to find out." And boy, did they. By 3 a.m., 3 basements had flooded, including the Thompsons. A retaining wall collapsed near the cul-de-sac. Water pushed up through floorboards, cracked concrete like it was papier-mâché, and turned flower beds into mudslides. Jack's footage showed it all. But what got the most replay on social media wasn't the destruction. It was the slow zoom on Karen Westfield's horrified face as a tiny geyser of brown water erupted from her front yard, sending her prized petunias into orbit. Physics, as Jack liked to say, always wins. And in the background of that viral clip, you could just barely hear a small voice asking, "Is that frog water?" Followed by Jack's low chuckle. "No, Timmy. That's karma." The creek hadn't vanished. It had simply gone undercover, waiting for its moment. And when the HOA buried it, they weren't protecting the neighborhood. They were building a pressure cooker. Now it was bursting at the seams. It was standing room only inside the Riverstone Heights Community Center. You could feel the static of tension in the air, neighbor against neighbor, pitchforks sharpened not in steel but in policy violations and soaked insurance claims. At the front, the Westfields sat stiffly, their usual smug confidence cracked like the foundations of their flooded estate. Karen was in pearls and a blazer that looked like it had been through one too many spin cycles of chaos. Richard kept loosening his tie, beads of sweat threatening to impeach his deodorant. And then Jack Walker stood. He wasn't wearing a suit or carrying a binder. He wore jeans, boots, and the steady, calm confidence of a man with receipts, lots of them. "I'd like to speak during the open floor session," he said, voice calm but cutting. Karen rolled her eyes. "Mr. Walker, this isn't the time to spread conspiracy theories." "Actually," Jack cut in, "it's the perfect time to talk about facts." He clicked his remote, and the projector behind him lit up. Slide 1. A 1962 geological survey showing the original wetland zone, the very one Maple Valley now sits on like a throne built of bad decisions. Slide 2. A close-up of the drainage pipe connecting the Westfields retention pond to Jack's former creek, complete with timestamps. Slide 3. A dead fish, floating belly up. A screenshot from Jack's video, Richard Westfield pouring mysterious liquid into the pond like a villain in a made-for-TV movie. Slide 4. GoPro footage of Karen directing HOA crews to sandbag her property as neighbors' homes turned into indoor swimming pools. Slide 5. The final blow. A printed email from the city engineer confirming that the recent flooding was the direct result of unauthorized alterations to the natural drainage system, specifically the diversion and burial of an active creek bed. Karen stood up, flustered. "This is taken out of context. The flooding is a city issue. Storm drainage has always been a problem." Jack pointed to the email projected on the wall. "That came from Carlos Vega, municipal engineer for the city of Broward County. He says your actions caused this. Not the rain. Not the city. You." A hush fell, and then a voice, trembling but loud, rose from the third row. It was Michael Rodriguez, a local contractor and father of two. He held up a soaked, crumpled piece of fabric, a red dress, faded and sagging with water damage. "This was my daughter's quinceañera dress," he said, voice cracking. "It was my mother's from Mexico. We were keeping it for Sophia's 15th birthday this year." He looked up at Karen, eyes burning. "Now's it sludge." Jack stepped aside as murmurs turned to outrage. Another neighbor chimed in. "My insurance denied our claim. They said we were living in a flood zone. That was never on the property maps." Margaret Beckett stood, raising a shaking hand. "You made me drain my koi pond," she said, tears shining in her eyes. "My husband built that pond. You said it didn't match the aesthetic standards. But it was the only thing keeping our yard dry." Karen banged the gavel. "This meeting is out of order." But it wasn't. It was exactly in order. Because for the first time in years, people were seeing the truth. Not just about water or bylaws, or who could hang what on their front porch, but about power and how it had been abused under the guise of community standards. Jack clicked to the final slide, a slow-motion video of water bursting through the storm drain and flooding the Westfields' yard. It looked almost poetic. He turned to face the crowd. "You were told the creek was dangerous. But the real danger wasn't nature. It was people who thought they could control it." Silence. Then a clap. Then another. And soon, the whole room was on its feet. Karen sat down, her face ashen. Richard leaned over, whispering something through clenched teeth. But it didn't matter. Because HOA might have buried a creek, but Jack just unearthed the truth. It started with a group chat titled, "Weekend Gardening Club Sunflower." At first glance, it looked innocent enough. just a few neighbors planning to spruce up the neglected community garden behind the clubhouse. But those who were in the know understood one crucial truth. There were no petunias being planted. This wasn't about flowers. This was about vengeance in flannel. Jack Walker was done playing defense. The flood had done more than destroy property. It had awakened the neighborhood. Suddenly, the quiet man who sat by the creek had become the reluctant leader of a rebellion armed with shovels, gumption, and a geological map from 1962. Every Saturday at 7 a.m., they gathered, moms in yoga pants, dads in work boots, teens bribed with donuts. To outsiders and Karen, it looked like a group of friendly locals beautifying public land. But in reality, they were unearthing history, one shovelful at a time. Their first target, a blocked culvert hidden behind the HOA's maintenance shed. The original drainage system had been intentionally clogged with construction debris and plastic barriers, likely to redirect runoff toward the Westfield's retention pond, and thus, eventually, Jack's backyard. Now it was time to let nature breathe again. "Guys," shouted Taylor, a young dad who'd once been fined for hanging a hammock between his trees. He held up a mangled piece of PVC. "They plugged this thing with broken patio chairs and a bowling ball?" "It was a metaphor," Jack muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "They were bowling over our common sense." By mid-morning, they'd uncovered the first major path of the original SWOI. The water, like a long-lost friend, began to trickle down its ancient route, timid at first, then stronger with every freed block. Kids waded in with plastic buckets, helping move rocks and rescue stranded frogs. Then came the scream. "What do you think you're doing?" Karen Westfield descended on the group like a Category 5 tantrum. She wore a sun visor that looked more weaponized than functional, and her clipboard slapped against her thigh like a holstered pistol. "This is vandalism," she shrieked, pointing at the muddy trench that now ran parallel to the clubhouse walkway. "You are destroying HOA property." Jack calmly turned around, covered in dirt, with a laminated paper in hand. "Actually, Karen," he said, already enjoying the moment, "per Section 12.3 of the HOA bylaws, residents are permitted to maintain or restore existing drainage systems if it contributes to property value aesthetics." He handed her the document. Karen snatched it like it bit her, scanning it with narrowed eyes. "This isn't aesthetic maintenance. This is sabotage." Jack smiled. "Tell that to the wildflowers." They seemed thrilled. By that point, more neighbors had joined, most holding tools, some holding phones filming Karen's meltdown in glorious 1080p. Someone had even set up a lemonade stand manned by Timmy, who charged Karen $5 per cup for HOA hydration compliance. By late afternoon, 3 major flow paths had been restored, and the creek was beginning to look less like a battlefield and more like a comeback story. The best part? Jack had timed the operation perfectly. That night, the forecast predicted more rain. As the sun dipped behind the trees and the water trickled through the newly cleared channel with a peaceful gurgle, Jack stood with the others, arms crossed, back sore and soul alight. "This isn't gardening," someone whispered. "No," Jack said, grinning. "This is hydrological justice." And as frogs returned to the rocks and the creek shimmered beneath the twilight sky, one thing was clear. The HOA might have thought they buried a stream, but instead, they planted a revolution. The next storm rolled in with all the subtlety of a marching band through a funeral. Dark clouds stacked on the horizon like a slow-building verdict, and Riverstone Heights held its breath. But this time, Jack Walker wasn't afraid. This time, the creek was ready. Thanks to weeks of gardening, ditch digging, culvert clearing, and Jack's unlikely rise as Riverstone's muddy-footed Moses, the original water channels had been fully restored. The SWOI, now bubbling and babbling like it never left, was once again the neighborhood's unsung hero. And as the first fat drops slapped the rooftops, Jack stood under his porch awning and smiled. By midnight, the storm was in full fury. The same kind of storm that had once turned basements into bathtubs and lawns into lagoons. But not this time. This time, the water knew where to go. It surged through the freshly cleared channels, rushed under restored culverts, twisted around rocks Jack and the crew had placed like breadcrumbs for nature to follow home. No more flooding, no more foul geysers rising from toilet drains, no more yard-to-yard canoe travel. Well, almost none. Because while the rest of the neighborhood held firm, one place didn't. Karen Westfield's home, the $1.2 million HOA-funded fortress perched arrogantly on what used to be the creek's natural path, began to sink. The water rose from beneath, not above. It burbled through her front lawn, cracked her driveway like a graham cracker, and pushed up through her foundation as if the earth itself was tired of her decor choices. By morning, the damage was unmistakable. The neighborhood group chat lit up like Christmas. Karen's koi pond is back, except now it's unintentional. Westfield house listed as waterfront property on Zillow yet. Karma flows downhill. Later that day, an emergency town hall was called, this time by the people, not the board. Every seat was taken. Neighbors clutched umbrellas and soggy documents. Kids played quietly in the corner, drawing frogs and floods with crayons. At the front of the room, Karen and Richard sat like deposed royalty, mud still caked on the edges of their designer loafers, their expressions a cocktail of rage and regret. Elaine Wong, Jack's neighbor and one of the first to speak up after the flood, took the mic. "It's time," she said plainly. "Time to vote for leadership that listens, not lectures. That works with nature, not against it." Applause. Real, thunderous, cathartic applause. The vote wasn't even close. The entire HOA board was dissolved. Elaine was unanimously elected as the new president, with a council of neighbors who had actually dug the dirt and felt the flood. Karen didn't say a word as she left, just climbed into her car, engine coughing, tires splashing through her still soggy lawn. She didn't even take her belongings. She didn't need to. What she left behind said enough. A sign. Danger. Water hazard. Keep children away. It had once stood as a symbol of her war on Jack's Creek. 2 days later, Elaine planted a new post beneath it, same wood, same nails, only now with a fresh, hand-painted plaque that read, "Nature isn't a danger. Nature is a teacher." Jack helped her hammer it into the ground. No ceremony, no speeches. Just a smile between neighbors and a quiet moment of understanding. The creek whispered beside them, alive and well. And for the first time in a long while, Riverstone Heights didn't feel like a neighborhood run by rules. It felt like a home that had learned how to breathe again. It was a quiet morning in Riverstone Heights, the good kind of quiet, the kind you only get after a long fight has finally been won. Dew clung to the grass, like a memory. Bird song floated between the trees. And at the edge of Jack Walker's backyard, the creek ran like it had never stopped, clear, strong, and absolutely unapologetic. The Swoy was back, not just in geography but in spirit. The frogs had returned, their throaty symphony echoing from under rocks and around reeds. Dragonflies skimmed the surface like neon surfers. Even a blue heron had taken up residence on a log near the bend, a silent sentinel to nature's quiet rebellion. Jack sat on his old folding chair, the one with a frayed armrest and rusted hinges, a thermos of coffee in one hand and his other fingers dipped into the water. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. Because sometimes justice doesn't come in the form of lawsuits or press conferences. Sometimes justice comes in the form of a single cool current winding its way through the earth, unstoppable, undeniable, and free. The neighborhood had changed, too. Elaine and the new HOA board, more neighbors than authority figures, had launched a community watershed restoration project. Native plants were reintroduced. Bird houses went up. A butterfly garden bloomed where HOA fines used to grow. Property values? Up 23% in just 2 quarters. Turns out, when you work with nature instead of against it, the market notices. And then there was Timmy. He still came to the creek most afternoons, though now he brought a notebook instead of a frog bucket. Jack had given him a lawn chair of his own. One day, Timmy sat beside Jack, legs swinging over the edge, and said, "I'm writing something. For school. About you." Jack chuckled. "About plumbing?" "No. Timmy grinned. About the creek. About how you saved it. About how it saved us. A few weeks later, Timmy's essay, Mr. Jack's Creek, won first place in the state's Young Environmental Writers Contest. His teacher read it at the next HOA meeting. Half the room cried. The other half stood and clapped. Margaret, the widow whose koi pond was stolen by the old HOA, baked a cake in the shape of a frog. Someone else brought shirts that said, "Let the water speak." Even Richard Westfield, now living 2 towns over in a beige house with no yard and plenty of irony, sent a legal notice to take his name off the HOA's founding documents. Jack never mentioned it, but he framed the letter and hung it in his bathroom. That morning, as the sun filtered through the trees, Jack leaned back in his chair and watched the light dance on the water. It sparkled like it had secrets, like it remembered every shovel, every rainstorm, every child's laugh it had carried. He smiled, not at the victory, but at the peace. Because he understood something now, something he hadn't when this all began. Sometimes, he said aloud, speaking only to the creek, justice doesn't come from a courtroom. He let the cool stream slide over his hand like a handshake with the earth itself. It comes from nature. And nature, he'd learned, never forgets where it's supposed to flow.